The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody to the Yaron Brook Show on this Thursday night. I mean, it's been, I think, every night this week. We are broadcasting live every day to keep you updated on the state of the world. I've tried to stay away from some coronavirus topics. We've done a bunch of interviews recently. Yesterday, we had Andrew Bernstein talking about his new book about heroism. A nice break from kind of the dreary, depressing, constant flow of bad, horrible news about the state of the world, about coronavirus, about everything else. But the break is over. We're back. We're back to the topic of the day. We're back to coronavirus. And today, I want to focus on a topic I don't see discussed that much out there. I'm sure people like Peter Schiff are talking a lot about it, but just if you open up the news, other than giving you the top level unemployment numbers or something like that, there's not a lot of talk about the economy, what's going to happen, what happens when we get out of this, what happens on the other side of this. And I thought we'd talk about that today and encourage questions on economics, questions on markets, questions on what this is doing to our economy, and not just the coronavirus. We can talk about the coronavirus, but lockups, lockdowns, whatever you want to call it, house arrest, stimulus packages, Federal Reserve printing money like crazy, subsidies, bailouts, unemployment insurance, loans, all kinds of fun stuff that the government is doing. Basically, a total spending spree that'll probably be in excess of $6 trillion. The annual budget of the U.S. is, I think, around $4 trillion. So this will be double the amount of money, more than double the amount of money they spend on a particular year. They will be spending, and we haven't even got to the, infrastructure bill, which might be another $1 trillion or $2 trillion. Who knows? So, so I thought we'd talk about the economics of a lockdown, the economic consequences of a lockdown. Then, of course, we can talk about coming out of this, kind of the consequences of how do you deal with what happened with the lockdown, and then the consequence of the changes that the economy has to go through because of coronavirus, and then on top of that, because of the lockdown, and then on top of that, the economic changes that we're going to have to go through as a consequence of the government's response to corona and the lockdown, the stimulus package, the Federal Reserve buying everything, and everything else that's involved in kind of the economic package, the bailout, the stimulus, everything. So, so that's what we're going to talk about. I'm happy, as I said, to take questions, super chat questions, and we'll go for this. Somebody asks, would you agree with me that all businesses need COVID-19 legal immunity in order to prevent workers from suing? I mean, I don't think they need legal immunity. I think what needs to be done, and unfortunately it can't be done, I think legal immunity, what should be done is the ability of workers to be able to, of businesses to have workers sign a release form. And if they don't want to sign the release form, they don't have to. But it's also true that such a release form would actually require, maybe, if there was some negotiation between the workers and the business, and that's what should have happened, you should have a negotiation where the business is committed to doing its best to provide a safe working environment. And of course, there should be some kind of liability release for customers, which will have to be also posted somewhere. If you go into a store, you're taking on the risk that you will get COVID at the store, and that's a risk you have to take. And buyer beware, enterer beware. So things like that. The problem is that our liability system, our legal system, and this is a whole other topic for a whole other day where we would have to bring a legal expert into this. I haven't really studied this in decades. But the whole liability system, our whole legal system with regard to liability is completely messed up, completely screwed up. That's why there's so many lawsuits. That's why everybody sues everybody. That's why any little accident you sue, because our legal system allows for that. And our legal system never used to be like that. There was a wonderful book written, I think, in the 1980s called Liability. And I forget the name of the author. And it was excellent because it did the whole history of our attitude towards liability law, what constituted liability law, when you could sue, when you couldn't sue, and how that evolved to turning liability law into basically an entire industry for redistributing wealth. And from what's called deep pockets, people who have money, to victims, people who suffer losses. And that's what our legal system has become. Another mechanism for redistribution of wealth. And of course, the mechanism for redistribution of wealth was the intention of the people who restructured the liability system in the United States. The book, Liability, quotes all these professors from Yale and Harvard, law professors, particularly from Yale, I think, who purposefully restructured the liability system in the United States to become an arm, if you will, a part of the redistribution programs of the United States of America. One of the complaints was welfare was not enough. Redistribution was not done on scale enough. What we needed was much more. And we'll shift the legal system. We'll let courts get into a position where they can remedy the injustices that our capitalist system creates, remedy the injustices that our political system won't remedy. We, Plato's philosopher kings, sitting as judges, as legal theorists, as rewriters of the basic assumptions of our legal institutions, we will make sure that wealth is redistributed and to accommodate and to fix these problems. And it's sad because the Supreme Court had many opportunities to rule against these different liability laws and to return us to a proper view of liability. And it's it is what it is. We are where we are. So yes, it would be great if we could have people sign liability releases. The courts won't uphold them. The courts won't uphold them in the world in which we live. So this is add that one more list to the things that need to be remedied in the world in which we live. Is we have to significantly, dramatically remedy our legal liability system throughout. All right, back to the economy. So look, let's talk about lockups for a minute. Lockdowns, lockups, whatever you want to call it. How can this ever be justified? So, and I want to think of it in terms of economics, but really, it's in terms of morality. Imagine a truly free market. Imagine a world in which government is separate from economics. The government does not intervene in the economy. Government cannot do stimulus packages. It doesn't provide loans to failed businesses. It cannot bail anybody out. It cannot provide welfare. It cannot provide unemployment insurance. That to some extent that is privatized. There's some welfare and so on, but for the most part, the economy works privately. People have jobs. People save for emergencies. But there's always going to be some people who don't. And imagine a virus, And imagine the government decides to do lockups, i.e., separate people, eliminate people's ability to make a living, eliminate jobs, eliminate businesses' ability to make a living and therefore pay employees, and no, payroll protection programs, none of this. Just, it's a free market. So you might have insurance, and insurance might cover some of it. But lockdown means everybody locks down. No jobs for a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Who knows how long? It looks like in some states in the United States, it's going to be 8, 12 weeks. How do people survive? Now, some businesses would have business interruption insurance that covers viruses, and they would have some money, and they would be able to employ some people. But they were not going to employ all people, and many people they won't employ because, hey, there's going to be massive shifts anyway. Now, there's going to be unemployment anyway because our behavior is going to change under coronavirus. So some unemployment is going to generate it anyway. Some private unemployment insurance will be consumed. People's savings will have to be used, and charity will have to be engaged. But if you, on top of that, lock down the economy, there is no way that any of those things can keep up. Certainly, insurance companies can't and won't insure against the government lockout. They can't insure against systematically every single business shutting down. You can't insure against risks like that. It's too systematic. It's too widespread. It would wipe any insurance company out. Insurance is based on diversification and the ability not to take on risks everywhere to everybody at the same time. That defeats the whole idea of insurance. It diversifies the risk. So it just is people would literally die. Not of the virus. They would die because they couldn't make a living. They would die of starvation. And again, unless you had charity to such an extent that it could cover it all, but that is, I think, science fiction. I mean, think about it right now. Supposedly, the latest numbers, 30 million people have filed for unemployment benefits since the virus hit. That's 30 million people on top of all the people who didn't have a job before that. Something like 4% of the population who were counted, or 3% of the population were counted, and then all the other people who weren't even looking at jobs because they were living off their parents or off the government or off other things. We're talking about tens of millions of people suddenly unemployed. The system, a free market system, couldn't cope with that, and it wouldn't, because it would never get to the point of shutting down the economy. Now, it's true. Maybe the consequence of that, like it seems like in Sweden, are more people die of the coronavirus or whatever the virus is. And that's possible. And as I've said before, maybe you lock down a certain region because it's a hot spot. You have to deal with hot spots. So you deal with New York City. And you shut it down for a certain period of time. But it is inconceivable, impossible, immoral, unthinkable to destroy an entire economy by shutting down an entire economy, which is what has been done in the United States of America and in much of Europe. Now, even if it saves lives, how many lives does it need to save? 1 million? 10,000? 100,000? Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide how many lives you save? And that determines the lockdown. Now, again, specific lockdowns in specific areas, in specific places, and maybe even for specific people, solely for those carrying the virus once they're being tested, are legitimate. But they can be ongoing, and they can be economy-wide. They can be locking down everybody, even places where there's little risk. It is truly astounding. And then, of course, the reason you can seemingly get away with it in a mixed economy is because all those people becoming unemployed are getting checks from the government. And many of them will actually get checks from the government that are higher, that are amounts higher than what they actually earned because of the way they boosted the unemployment insurance. And when the government runs out of money to give the unemployed, they will print more, which is exactly what they're doing today, printing massive amounts of money, literally printing it. I mean, not literally because money is electronic, but the equivalent of printing it. What they do is they issue bonds. They claim they borrow it. They borrow the money. They issue bonds. And then what happens is, right, is if they were really borrowing it, somebody out there, I don't know, Chinese, an American investor, life insurance company, would buy those bonds, and then the government would owe this investor money in the future. And that's bad enough, I would argue. That's bad enough, I would argue. But that's not exactly what happens. That's bad enough because it has to be paid back. So at some point, somebody has to be taxed in order to pay this person back. Plus, you know, we'll get to it. It sucks money out of the private economy and so on. But it has to be paid back somehow. So who actually is buying these bonds, just buying this debt that the government is issuing? When the government issues $2 trillion of debt to fund the stimulus package, who buys it today? Is it the Chinese? No. They don't have enough dollars right now. There's not enough, we're not importing enough stuff from China, so they don't have the dollars to buy it. Who's buying it? Is it American investors? No. Who in his crazy mind is going to buy 10-year bonds at a yield of, I don't know, 0.7% over 10 years? I mean, you'd have to be nuts. So who buys the bonds? Well, the Federal Reserve does. Now, where does the Federal Reserve have the money to buy the bonds? In a sense, the Federal Reserve is lending money to the government. Where does the Federal Reserve have the money to lend to the government? What productive activity does the Federal Reserve engage in that produces the resources to buy these government bonds? It doesn't. It prints the money. It literally creates the money on a computer out of thin air. It's a balance sheet thing. Here, take $2 trillion, we'll put it in your account, and, you know, it's not exactly how it works, but basically it's what it works. It's even more corrupt because they use an intermediary in order to buy the bonds from the government. That intermediary is a big bank, and the big bank makes money off of the transaction, right? Doing nothing, facilitating the printing of money from the Fed to the government. It's just money printed, literally, like the old days, printing presses. Well, again, not literally anymore. I mean, I saw a number here. I'm looking for the actual number. Yes, here it is. So just in case you're not convinced that this is what actually happened, last month, in, I think it was March, yes, March, the Federal Reserve basically bought up $1.3 trillion of treasury debt, of government bonds, in 1 month. $1.3 trillion. Paper money created in thin air. Well, electronic money created in thin ether. What? I don't know where it's created. So only in a mixed economy can you kind of print money and then hand it out to people and say, don't worry, be happy. You know, see, lockdowns are not so bad. We're handing you a check. You didn't have to even work for it. It's even better than a healthy economy. You actually can get to sit home, play with the kids, because they can't go to school, and we'll just hand you money, hand you wads of money. Now, you know, they feel bad, the government does, because they're handing wads of money to some people, but there are all these businesses, and the businessmen can't file for unemployment because they got a business. So what do? So, we'll create a payroll protection plan, but you can only use the money to pay your employees. How do you pay yourself? Well, to hell with that. How do you make a profit? Well, to hell with that. You have to stay closed. You can't make a profit because we're literally forcing you to stay closed. So if you're in business, who cares? We'll lend you money. The Federal Reserve is about to start a program next week that it's going to lend $600 billion to small to medium-sized businesses at low interest rates. Why? Well, because of the lockdown. Because we're not allowing them to actually produce. We're not allowing them to make a profit. We're not allowing them to actually work. So we have to bail them out. It's so convoluted. Now, the virus in and of itself, if it's allowed to spread, is a major problem economically. Of course, it's a major problem for the people who actually get it, and certainly for the people who get sick and go to hospital, and certainly for those who die from it. But the fear the virus creates, so it's certainly a public health issue, but it's also an economic issue because it changes people's behavior. It changes people's behavior. The whole structure of demand, the things that people want, the things that people want to buy, the things that people are willing to pay for, and therefore the things that will be produced, changes, shifts in ways that we can't even imagine. I mean, people will travel less, so airline industry will have to shrink. People will have to leave those jobs. What jobs get created? So if you actually had a free market and this was truly dynamic, we would be seeing that. We would be seeing companies going bankrupt. You can't go bankrupt anymore. The Fed and the government don't allow that. Can't go bankrupt. We'll bail you out. No bankruptcies. So no businesses going out of business because people are not demanding their stuff anymore because of the virus. Why not? Particularly given that the virus is not going to go away tomorrow. People's behaviors are going to change in fundamental ways for a long time. Some businesses should go out of business. And new businesses should get capital that accommodates this change of behavior. I don't know what those businesses would be. I wish I did. I'd invest in them. Zoom, video conferencing, probably with us for a long time. Probably a good income producer for a long time. Different video conferencing facilities, different ways for people to meet remotely. Different ways for people to engage in business. Ways I can't even imagine. You can't even imagine. Somebody has to invent still. To engage in business without face-to-face interaction. Where one is in the same room. Capital has to flow from that. And it has to flow from old ways of doing business. Stores are going to have to raise their costs. Raise their prices. Their costs have gone up. And some stores will go out of business because consumers won't allow them. There's no value there to raise price. Others will survive because consumers will be willing to absorb the price increase. So the structure of production during a pandemic has to change dramatically. A pandemic like this, where people are really afraid, where people are changing their behavior, where people are changing what they do. And what happens when the government steps in? The government is stopping that change from happening. Or at least it's slowing it down and distorting it. So you can't go bankrupt. Now again, this all gets complicated by the fact that the lockdowns. Because the lockdowns are exacerbating the problem created by the coronavirus. The lockdowns are exacerbating the problem and creating a whole new set of problems that have to do with businesses that wouldn't be affected by the virus are now affected by the virus. So restaurants would have been affected anyway because people would have wanted to socially distance. Fewer people would have gone to restaurants. Restaurants would have to probably raise prices, which would reduce demand. Some restaurants would have gone out of business. It's just the way the world works. But now, there are all kinds of industries that wouldn't not have been affected by this virus that are now affected by the virus because of the lockdown, because they can't produce, they can't create, they can't build, they can't make stuff. Right? So, the way in which this distorts the economy is so profound, it's so deep, it runs through almost every aspect of this economy. And it prevents capitalism, free markets, supply and demand, from adjusting, from capital flowing to where it's needed. It's preventing entrepreneurs from starting businesses. And again, I don't know what those businesses are. I mean, you could imagine making more masks or making more, hand cleansers or whatever. But there have to be more structural changes. If people don't go to restaurants, what will they do? If people, the obvious one is they don't go to cinema, so more subscriptions to Netflix. Okay, that's obvious. But there's so many non-obvious ways. And there's so many things that producers, innovators, would come up with that we can't imagine. That's not going to happen because we're not letting the economy adjust. We're not allowing for that flexibility. But it's worse than that, because it's not just that we've done lockdowns that are affecting businesses that shouldn't be affected. But then we're subsidizing certain businesses. We're subsidizing certain employees not to be fired. We're bailing out industries. I mean, we're bailing out the cruise industry. Now, cruises, why should cruises be bailed out? I mean, cruises take a risk. They stick thousands of people on a boat in the middle of the ocean. If a virus enters that boat, and we've seen food poisoning on cruises and other things, but if a virus like the coronavirus enters in a boat, it can be devastating. But who should take that risk? Me? Why should I, the taxpayer, bail out an industry and people who use that industry, who know the risks that are involved? So they're negotiating now the bailout of the cruise business. It's not final. Airlines who have taken on huge amounts of debt. And why should they be bailed out? I mean, even without the lockdowns, even without the travel restrictions, airlines would be in trouble because a virus puts the airlines in trouble. Why should they suffer the consequences of what happens in the world? And indeed, airlines need to shrink because post-virus, airline travel is going to be reduced quite a bit, I suspect. But if we bail them out, why not let them file for bankruptcy? Why shouldn't shareholders who benefited when airline stocks went like this, did really, really well, when airlines were profitable, why shouldn't they be wiped out when a virus hits and the airline has a lot of debt, so the airline is not in a good position to deal with this crisis and therefore should go bankrupt and shareholders should be wiped out? Now, when airlines go bankrupt, it doesn't mean they burn the planes. It doesn't mean they shut down every office. It means they restructure. It means shareholders lose everything. Bondholders, debt holders lose something. And everything is restructured. And they come out of it maybe smaller, maybe more thoughtfully constructed, and maybe next time, when things are great, they don't take on huge amounts of debt. But no. And this is the beauty of the bankruptcy laws in the United States. They're actually structured in a way to facilitate companies restructuring when economic shocks like this one happen in order to be able to come out of the shock in better conditions. But no, our politicians won't allow that. We're going to bail them out. And Boeing. I mean, here's a company that, through its own negligence, caused the death of several hundred people. Cost-cutting, negligence, bad culture, very anti-Boeing culture. Why shouldn't it suffer the consequences of all of that? And yeah, also coronavirus. But again, coronavirus without government lockdown would still have hit Boeing because it hit the airlines. Why can't they go bankrupt? Why can't they restructure? Because no, we don't believe in that. And the central planners in chief, the central planners in Washington, those wise philosophy kings, those wise men, they know who should survive and who should die, who should be allowed to make money, who should not, who gets the benefit of the subsidies, of the bailouts, of the stimulus, and who should not. So what we've got with all these government programs, with the shutdown exacerbating the effects of the corona, then you've got all these government bailouts structured from the Fed. You're creating massive disincentives for businesses to recover in a healthy way, for people to come back to work. Disincentives for companies to plan better for the future, to think more thoroughly about risk. It's called moral hazard. Why worry about risk? Leverage to the hilt. Who cares about tomorrow? The government will bail us all out anyway. And the same with employees. Why save? Who needs to save? If I get fired, I get unemployment insurance, which sometimes provides me more money than I had before. So, massive disincentives for current behavior, getting a job, for future behavior, managing risk. If you thought the bailouts of the banks were bad, and it's going to be interesting, will there be a backlash? Will there be a backlash against all the bailouts and the stimulus like there was in 2009? I suspect not. There's not going to be a, what do you call it, the 1%. What were the demonstrations called? They demonstrated against the 1%, demonstrations against Wall Street. I don't think you're going to see that because it's not banks this time. And we hate banks. No, this is Main Street now. Yeah, the Occupy Wall Street movement. There won't be an Occupy this time. Why? Well, first, because Democrats and Republicans all agree that we have to have the bailouts. We have to have the lockdowns. And who are they going to occupy? Restaurants? Small businesses? Airlines? No, nobody occupies those. There's no villain like Wall Street was. So we've learned nothing from the '08 crisis. We throw the same solutions. Go out there, bail everybody out. Printing with no end. What consequences does that have long term? Well, you might see inflation spike. I don't know that you will, but you might. But inflation doesn't necessarily affect prices uniformly. Indeed, you will see inflation. The question is, where will the inflation go? It might not go to your basket of goods. So it might not be captured in what's called the CPI, the consumer kind of inflation, consumer price inflation. It might go to stock prices or bond prices or real estate prices or who knows. But you know that all this excess money goes somewhere at some point, inflates things. And there's a massive cost to that because if stock prices are artificially inflated or bond prices are, the allocation of capital throughout the economy is suboptimal. It's distorted. It's perverted. And some people get really, really rich while jobs are not created, while people who are trying to save get nothing because bond prices go up, which means yields, return on, yields on debt go down. So your saving, your checking account produces no return. So it reallocates wealth in distortive, non-productive ways. And then, of course, the temptation is, once you bail out companies, once you bail out industries, once you provide all of these industries with government money, our money, then what's the temptation of government? Well, if you're going to take our money, then we have to regulate you. We have to control you. We have to tell you how to use it. We have to make sure you don't abuse it. We have to make sure you serve the public interest. None of the shareholder wealth maximization. You now should be stakeholders and socially optimal companies or whatever, sustainable, Green New Deal, fill in the blank. So we're going to have Dodd-Frank, which is the big regulatory bill for banks. that resulted from the bailout. There was a consequence, part of the consequence of the bailout. Are we going to have Dodd-Frank for every one of these industries? I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a huge boon in additional regulations. So what we're experiencing today, what we're living through today, what we will be living through for the next decade or two, and those young people out there, I feel for you, is an economic disaster. Not the kind of disaster, and this is, governments have gotten really, really, really good at this. Not the kind of disaster that sees people starving in the streets en masse. Not the kind of disaster that sees just a crushing of the entire economy, a massive collapse. That will be avoided. Not the kind of disaster where you have super hyperinflation. Won't happen. The disaster is the disaster of the unseen, and that's what makes it so much more evil. I wish we had hyperinflation. I wish we had a massive collapse. Maybe we'd learn something from it. Maybe we'd see it for what it is. The arrogance and ignorance and power lust of politicians and treasury bureaucrats and, just little people who want power over others. But instead, what we're going to get is slow death, slow destruction, slow annihilation, no economic growth. It's going to be, I said this in '08. I said, you're not going to get a crash. You're not going to get a disaster. You're not going to get gold at 10,000. You're not going to get hyperinflation. What you're going to get is slow economic growth, which hurts anybody trying to make a living, anybody trying to accumulate a fortune, anybody trying to be an entrepreneur, anybody trying to benefit and improve their lives. And what did we get? We got the Obama and Trump years with pathetic 2% economic growth. 20 million jobs were created in a decade from 2008 to now. 30 million jobs have been destroyed in a month. In a month, we destroyed all the jobs because we didn't create that many that were created during that decade. And it's going to take us longer to recreate them. This is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. This is what's called an L. Drop, long-term, slow growth, real problems. And again, those of us who are older, who maybe have some savings, we'll do fine. We'll do okay, particularly maybe if we're stock market. The stock market has recovered in April, the best month it's had since 1987. Why? Because the economy's so strong? Because things are looking up for America? Because our economy is so robust? No. It's because there's the Fed and the government are just flushing money out into the system. And that money's going to the stock market. It's completely delinked from the underlying real economy, from the actual pain of people. Now, we could see the stock market drop quite a bit as the bad news hits. But the market needs massive adjustments. Companies need to go bankrupt. New companies need to be created. Employees need to be retrained. They need to be moved around. Massive changes have to happen. And yet, and the government's not allowing that to happen. And the Fed are not allowing that to happen. And notice, this is under Trump. It wouldn't be different on anybody else. They're all the same. There's no difference. Trump was gonna drain the swamp. He just brought his own swamp animals. Right? So more flat economic growth, more stagnation, more dread, and particularly for young people looking for a job, looking to go, to improve, looking to save money, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. Right. So those of you who are young, it's hard, but go into fields that have a future. Try to look into the world and see, okay, given all these changes, where's wealth being created? And it's still true that the best place for wealth creation is Silicon Valley, or technology more broadly. Not Silicon Valley as a location. Silicon Valley is an attitude across the country. It's still true that is the least regulated of all industries, although that's going to change after this election. No matter who wins, big tech is going to come out of massive regulation, which is going to hurt the entire tech space. It's very difficult as an economist. It's very difficult to be optimistic about the future. It's very difficult to look at the future and say, this is America. America should be growing at 4, 5, 6% economic growth. It's gone. And add to that, the calls for getting rid of globalization, for tariffs, for building walls, for bringing industry back to the United States, all moves that will decapitate our standard of living, will reduce our quality of life, will destroy our ability to create wealth. So that is where we are. Sorry, no good news. All right, I've got a few super chat questions here. Does government cause people to drop out of the labor force with welfare? Jim Rickard says, we never had a true recovery post-2008. I agree with that. The economy lost dynamism. Zombie firms don't restructure. Workers give up. I think all of that is right. Now, I think on the worker side, it took workers a long time to re-enter the job market, partially because the jobs weren't there and partially because they weren't incentivized to do so because unemployment benefits were so positive, were so large. But absolutely, I agree with Jim Rickard. That is, zombie companies are everywhere. And again, we're bailing them out. The Fed is buying their bonds, bailing them out, lowering interest rates, eliminating risk premiums, the premium you have to pay for a risky asset. Well, if the Fed is willing to buy cheaper, then who are you? And what you're creating is a whim-driven, emotion-driven economic structure that is driven by the whim of the central planner, by the whim of the Federal Reserve. Which bonds does it want to buy? Which municipalities does it want to help? Which companies should it support? And yes, what you created is an economy with no dynamism. Again, only dynamism of the last 10 years has been in tech. And even that, I think, is going to go down. You can have zombie firms, zombie workers, and welfare that encourages people not to work. I mean, the only thing we can do is fight for freedom. And it should start now by fighting the lockups. It should move on to fighting the stimulus package. It should move on to fighting government intervention in every aspect of the economy. This is not, fighting for freedom right now is not some theoretical thing. It's not some one day. Your economy, which means your lives, your choices are being destroyed right now. Destroyed. Your future, if you're young, but all of us, is being destroyed right now by power-lusting politicians, their economic advisors, their gurus in academia and everywhere else, who want to run your life. Your freedom is being destroyed right now. When are you going to wake up and actually fight for it? Go out into the street, socially distance, because that's the right thing to do, and fight for it. Who do you fight? You fight the bastards who are doing this to you. At least, at the very least, make your voices heard. Now, I'm not talking about the people who agree with all this. I'm talking to you who, I hope, at least some of you, agree with me. It's time to stand up and fight for this. It's time to make your voices heard in any way you can on social media. And not just fight for get rid of the lockups. No, you need to fight for capitalism, fight for laissez-faire capitalism, fight for government getting out. I mean, if anything, this crisis has proved the complete, unquestioned incompetence of our government. Because let's be clear. There was no reason to get this far. There was no reason for lockups. There's no reason for a $2.2 trillion bailout. Actually, $3 trillion bailout. When we first heard about the pandemic, our government could have gone to the private sector, ramped up production of testing, created a massive infrastructure of testing and tracking and isolating those who caught the virus. Could have warned older people in old age homes and so on to isolate themselves because the information was known even in February, early February, that old people were most susceptible to this. We could have, and we still need to, but we don't, test, track, isolate on a massive scale. Take a few billion out of this $2 trillion monstrosity and do that. It's not that expensive. It's not that expensive. But our government won't do it. Trump won't do it. Cuomo won't do it. Newsom won't do it. They won't do it. Now, I've heard criticisms. Then I'll go back to the super chat. I've heard criticisms that, hey, Yaron, what do you mean? You're a capitalist. If a government doesn't have a right to test and to isolate and to track. Oh, yes, it does. In an emergency, it does. Now, again, they should have declared an emergency. They should have given us parameters for what an emergency is and how an emergency goes away. But assume this is an emergency, they should have declared an emergency. And in an emergency, when you have a silent killer out there, it's absolutely appropriate for the government to stop you and test you. And if you are carrying the disease, then you are now a threat, a risk to people around you. And the government has every right to then isolate you. And I don't see any problem in tracking, and there are a variety of different ways in which one can track without massive violation of people's privacy, of figuring out who this person met with, what airplane he was on, what public transportation does he use, and then trying to contact the people who might be exposed to him, and they should be thankful for this, so that they can get tested. There's nothing rights violating in any of that. The government can use force in self-defense. And when there is a virus, that is self-defense. Let's see. Since mass testing, tracking, and isolation should not be required to reopen, why do you advocate for it? Because it's the right thing to do. Because if we reopen without it, which I still advocate for, I still think we should reopen, then a lot of innocent people are going to get sick and die. A lot of, and you'll get another spike of this, and then they'll shut down the economy again. You think the statists will have any qualms about shutting it down again? The only way to prevent this from being cyclical and to prevent them from shutting us down again is to test, track, and isolate now, while we reopen, so that the reopening can be permanent, so we don't shut down again. And if we didn't have nutty politicians who wanted to shut us down, I'd still advocate for testing, tracking, isolation as a health issue. This is, I believe, and the data suggests, thank you, Luke, really appreciate it, that this is a dangerous disease, certainly to a segment of the population. And to the extent that we need to know who has it and who doesn't. Now, I think most people voluntarily do it. I am eager to go to a place to pay so that I can be tested. I want to know. So I don't think the government would have to do much. I don't think the government would have to be that involved. I think insurance companies have an incentive to know whether you have it or not. You have an incentive to know. The government has an incentive to know. Surely we can pay for enough testing. And then tracking, again, is in everybody's self-interest. And isolating makes complete sense of those people who have it. And self-isolating, voluntary isolation, for those people who are particularly vulnerable to it. People who are old should be isolated. People who have pre-existing conditions, if they're dangerous enough, and if the person is old enough, let's say over 50, they should self-isolate. Anybody over 70 should self-isolate. But to know what to do, to know how big of a threat it is, to know how big of a problem it is, to know at what point we can just say, recommend to people, go for it, doesn't matter anymore, it's over. You have to test. And nobody is testing. Nobody is testing. Oh, the tests are pathetic. I mean, Trump promised us 5 million tests a day weeks ago. We still don't have any close to that. We've done 5 million tests from the beginning of time. 6 million or whatever, right? But we should be $5 million tests today, even at that pace, right? You get 50 million in 10 days. It would take you 3 months to get the U.S. population, but that's good. And some people would have to get tested more than once. If you're a worker at a old age kind of facility, whatever type, you should get tested, if not every day, every couple of days. I've heard frustrated rallying cries of, I can't believe we didn't figure this out. This is America. But they don't know what made America what it is. Exactly. What made America what it is freedom. What made America what it is respect for reason, not for power-lusting, emotionalist, lie-spewing, leader. Freedom, science, respect for reason. That's what made America great again. And you can't make it great again unless you rediscover those virtues. And if we had that, if we had respect for reason and science, then we would have done what every single plan written about what America should do in the case of a pandemic, we would have followed the plan. The CDC had a plan, very reasonable plan. Amesh Adalja, who I hope to interview tomorrow, he was involved in putting together a plan with immunologists. And what was the plan? The plan primarily focused on test, track, isolate. And some countries did that. South Korea, Taiwan. They did that. And they were very successful. To some extent, Japan did that. I mean, Sweden is failing, not because it didn't do a lockdown. It's failing because it didn't do enough testing. The reason you get so many deaths in Sweden, you're getting a lot of deaths per capita in Sweden, is because they didn't test. They didn't isolate. And particularly, they didn't pay attention to nursing homes. They didn't pay attention to where old people live, which is relatively easy to do because they're all in one place. And therefore, they got a lot of deaths in those nursing homes. When they could have, again, if they tested the people going in, the people coming out. If you test, you can control. Without testing, you're blind. Again, we'll talk about all this tomorrow with Amesh. I'd rather focus on economics. Let's see. What do you think they will force the bailout recipients to go through a prepackaged bankruptcy like they did with GM and Chrysler? That was allegedly to prevent the moral hazard. But it didn't. It didn't prevent the moral hazard. What it actually did was the prepackaged bankruptcy of GM and Chrysler. This was in 2009 under the Obama administration. Basically violated every principle of bankruptcy law. It rewrote contracts, or it ignored contracts. It ignored contracts. So that the labor unions benefited enormously from the prepackaged bankruptcy. A prepackaged bankruptcy that was not dictated by the rule of law, but dictated by government. So it didn't solve the moral hazard problems. Indeed, what it created was a problem, which is prepackaged bankruptcy is fine in, if it follows the rule of law, if it's not ruled by the government. But imagine bondholders whose contracts were completely rewritten arbitrarily by the government. That creates a whole new set of risks for them. So when is the government going to do this again? Which companies? And it creates, again, distortions that are unseen in debt markets, in investor markets, in corporate markets. And that is what contributes ultimately to the stagnation I'm talking about. Now, will they force them to go prepackaged bankruptcies? I don't know. It doesn't look like it. Airlines got a bailout without the prepackaged bankruptcy. And shareholders have not been wiped out. And I don't know that any of the companies are going to go through that. We'll see. We'll see. In some cases, Trump has suggested that he wants the government to own equity in these companies, become owners. That could be even worse. And then think about the bailouts of the states. Illinois wants a bailout. Illinois, the most irresponsible, fiscally irresponsible state in the union, the most bankrupt state in the entire union. They want all of us to bail them out. And I think the federal government will. If not under Trump, then under Biden. Somebody's going to bail out Illinois. I sometimes feel resentment or even hatred for the vulnerable group for we are being forced to sacrifice for. I try to remember it's not their fault. Would you comment on the impact of welfare state on America's goodwill? Absolutely. This is why, by the way, Americans have always had more goodwill, were more benevolent, were more friendly, were more sympathetic to their neighbors than Europeans. Because the welfare state creates resentment. The welfare state creates winners and losers. The welfare state is a zero-sum game. The welfare recipient's gain is your, if you're productive, loss. Every gain is somebody's loss. Every stimulus package is somebody's loss. Every time the Fed goes into the markets and creates liquidity, it's somebody's loss and somebody's gain. It's all a zero-sum game. And that zero-sum game creates resentment because the losers in the game resent the so-called winners. They're not really winners, but the short-term winners of the game. It creates the hatred, resentment, ugliness, and wanting to intervene in other people's lives. Wait a minute. If I have to pay for your health care, exercise. If I'm going to pay for your health care, don't drink sugary drinks. If I'm going to pay for your health care, or if I'm going to pay for your job, these are the kind of jobs I want you to do. And you see, it's self-reinforcing and self-eating. The more the government intervenes in the economy, the more it will intervene even further in the future in the economy. It creates the problems, it creates the resentments, it creates the envy, it creates the necessity to fix the problems that it created. And it's a cycle, and nobody stops it. And unless you step in and just chop it all off, have a clear plan, drive to that plan. So yes, I completely understand your resentment, and yes, it is a complete and utter, pure consequence of the welfare state. I read about stores of French fries and farmers begging people to eat fries. Where are the fries at 30 cents on the dollar? Price signal broken, sad. I don't know what you're talking about exactly, but yeah, price signals are very broken. We some production lines are, have to fail, right? Because of the coronavirus, again, our demand for certain goods changes. So there are too many hotel rooms maybe. Or maybe there are too many restaurants. Or maybe because our demand for these things is going to shrink. But the lockdowns exacerbate that and cause these massive failures. And of course, anti-gouging laws and anti-all kinds of laws. are going to make this much, 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 much worse. Obligatory with the thoughts on Justin Amash as a Libertarian candidate for 2020. I'm sad that he's the Libertarian candidate. I mean, I like Justin Amash. I don't agree with him on certain things, in particular about foreign policy. I really dramatically disagree with him about foreign policy. But I would vote for him because on everything else, he's been good. And he's been courageous, which is very rare in a politician. He stood up to the man. He stood up to voters. He stood up to his political party. He spoke truth to power. And he strikes me as kind of an honest player. Now, again, I would have to hold my nose because of the foreign policy, but I like Justin. I like what he stands for. I like what he represents other than the foreign policy. And I think he's much better than Ron Paul or Rand Paul. He has much more courage. And he's not a conspiracy theory nut. He doesn't have these weird views about conspiracies. So yeah, I hate the Libertarian Party. I think it's a disreputable, meaningless, anarchy-filled political party that is nihilistic in some sense. Now, maybe with Justin there, they can restructure and they can become better, but I'm suspicious. So I'm torn because, of the candidates, certainly Justin Amash is the best by far of them, and he has some political experience. So, yep. Any thoughts on the Michigan protests? Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned this before. I'm sympathetic. The Michigan lockdown is egregious. It is an egregious violation of individual rights. It is ridiculous. I can understand locking down downtown Detroit, but even the suburbs don't need a lockdown. Rural Michigan, Michigan's a big state. Rural Michigan certainly does not need a lockdown. However, I think that the Michigan protesters have politicized this. They haven't made it about rights. They made it about Trump. I think they have disrespected the science in that they don't isolate. Again, I recommend to you the Israeli protest against Bibi Netanyahu a few weeks ago, where thousands of people went out into the streets, but they kept distance, 6 feet from one another, and they respectfully occupied space. They respectfully engaged in civil disobedience. There's a lockdown in Israel in order to protest. They didn't, just ignore the actual risks and dangers that exist out there. And by doing that, ignore the science and ultimately the victims. So I think I'm all for protest. I think it should be done smartly. I think it should be done in a way that will garner respect, in a way that will garner attention, not in a way that will garner ridicule. Do you believe there's a peak level of wealth already attained that drives intellectual laziness and apathy towards reason? Has humanity plateaued due to the bounty of a small few productive geniuses? No, I don't think so. There's certain element to the fact that when you're comfortable, there's a disincentive to seek truth and to be radical. Life is comfortable. Why shake things up? But I don't think that's because, I think that can happen at a lot of different levels of wealth. And I don't think that's a fundamental. I think that's kind of a subsidiary. The fundamental is the rotten philosophy, the rotten educational system, the rotten ideas that our culture inculcates in its young and then reinforces throughout adulthood, so that people expect authority, they expect to be told what to do, they expect to be taken care of, they expect the mixed economy, the welfare state, the environmentalist movement, they demand all those. And The other aspect of it is, again, philosophically, is they fear change. They fear progress. They fear economic growth. And that's, again, the same kind of philosophy. The philosophy that undercuts reason will increase fear, because once you lose your means of knowing the truth, once you lose your basic means of survival, what are you left with? Emotion. And since emotion can't guide you towards success, then you fear. Justifiably, you become afraid. And then altruism chops off any potential for you to attain, achieve, pursue happiness. You're guilty. You're a sinner. You need a sacrifice, or you need to be sacrificed. Either way. Have you seen Tiger King? Thoughts? No, never will. Also, can you elaborate on, I mean, it's just, I don't understand the attraction. It seems to me, it's a bunch of weird people. It's a bunch of stupid people. It's a bunch of ugly people. Why would I watch it? I mean, there's some amazing things that you could watch about exciting, stimulating, interesting, fascinating. Why watch ugliness? I will not watch ugliness. Also, can you elaborate on why we do have the right to own tigers, and why doesn't government have the right to stop me? Well, it only has the right to stop you if you're violating other people's rights. So if you're irresponsibly holding the tigers in ways that they could get loose and go eat people, then why couldn't you own tigers? If you can own cats, if you can own dogs, if you can own little birds, if you can own fish, why can't you own tigers? What's different about tigers? So absolutely you can own tigers, as long as you can guarantee to your neighbors that these tigers do not represent a risk. And if they do represent a risk, then the neighbors should be able to complain to the government. The government should come in and they should take the tigers away from you and put them in a zoo or send them back to where they came from. Animals do not have rights. Rights are a concept that can only be applied to an animal that possesses reason, thought, conceptualization. Because what do rights protect? Rights protect our ability to reason and our ability to use our reason to produce. Animals don't produce. Animals cannot have rights. The concept of rights doesn't apply to the activities that they engage in. I mean, imagine if you say, well, tigers have rights and what do tigers eat? I don't know. Deer have rights. Well, what is the tiger violating the deer's rights when it eats it? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But more fundamentally, the reason we need rights, and this, to some extent, the Enlightenment understood, but this is, Ayn Rand really is the one who first really elaborates this. The reason we need rights, the reason we have rights, is that reason is our basic means of survival. And for reason to be efficacious as our means of survival, it must be free of coercion. Coercion incapacitates reason. Coercion incapacitates reason. So therefore we need to protect ourselves from coercion. That's what rights are. Rights are the protection against coercion. Rights are the recognition of the fact that as reasoning beings we need to be free from coercion. So you can voluntarily protect animals. You can buy some land and put animals there and protect them and not allow hunting and not allow anything. Or not. But it's a choice we as individuals make. You can team up with a group of your friends and start a foundation and buy up land and put tigers there and leave them alone. But if somebody else chooses to buy a tiger and do whatever they want with it, it's their right. Now, to be cruel to animals, I think, is immoral. But that's not the same as illegal. So my view is we should shun people who are cruel to animals. We should have nothing to do with people. We should discriminate against people who are cruel to animals. But the government has no role in protecting them. The government is only there to protect rights, which means human beings. The Libertarian Party is all you have left with the Nationalist GOP. They're literally beyond repair. It's probably best to build up the LP. Build up from what? I'm not sure you can build up from the quicksand, and not quicksand is too nice, from the swamp that is the Libertarian Party. I mean, I would rather have Justin Amash run as an independent. Now, the advantage of running as a Libertarian is that he's already registered in every state. The Libertarian Party is. They've already taken care of that. Right? And, but I think the Libertarian Party is hopeless. He can't win, and in the Libertarian Party in and of itself is hopeless. It was founded by bad people, Murray Rothbard among them, and it has been dominated by bad people, and I don't think you can easily escape that. And it's got a horrible reputation of having bad people involved with it. And I don't think you can escape that. I believe in founding. We need a new party. You know, there's a party floating around, the Capitalist Party. It's got a great, program. We need to fund that party and launch it. And we need to replace the Libertarian Party. I don't think you can improve it. You'd have to really take it over, and I don't think you can. So I think we'd have to replace it. You'd have to start a new political party that's better, substantially, significantly better than the Libertarian Party. Laws are not about ethics. Laws are not about morality. Laws are about the protection of individual rights. Now, they have to be moral, but they don't legislate morality. Lots of things are immoral. Lying is immoral. But unless the lie violates somebody's rights, like fraud, it's not illegal. Right? It's immoral to evade as an individual. It's unethical to evade reality. You can't outlaw that. You can't have a law against that. Laws are limited to the protection of our rights. That is our protection against coercion from others, against fraud from others. So the laws are written to protect you, your property, from other people taking it, from other people intruding on it, from other people violating your right. That's it. Nothing more. Nothing beyond that. Now, that is guided by morality, because the definition of rights are a moral concept. But it's only one part of morality, one aspect of morality. Not everything about morality, not how we treat animals, not how we treat ourselves, which is the biggest part of morality. The most important part of morality is how you treat yourself. And yet the law has nothing to say about that. Should have nothing to say about it. Yaron, what are your thoughts on Gates seemingly having a finger in everything having to do with this corona deal, from the models to the vaccines? Do you think he's being pushed on us? No, I mean, I'm a Bill Gates fan up to a point. Again, his politics are horrible. He's completely wrong on politics, and he's influenced by an egalitarian John Rawlsian philosophy, and I think that's unfortunate and sad. But he's not trying to kill people. He's not trying to, he's got a massive amount of wealth. He cares about the world, and you can see it in what he's done with polio and what he's done with other diseases, and how he's handled his philanthropy around these things. He's done it in a responsible, amazingly innovative and productive way. So, I give him kudos for that. If you're going to be a philanthropist, at least be a good one. And now you've got this massive problem, and he invested in nuclear energy because he thinks that's a big problem. He's a believer in the catastrophic dangers of global warming, but he is not just somebody to sit in his hands. So he thinks that's a problem, so he goes out and he funds a company to work on an innovative solution for nuclear energy, and he had that, and he was going to build that nuclear power plant in China until Trump administration stopped him from doing it. Stopped the technology transfer because it's China. Can't do that. So Gates is stuck with that. Then coronavirus hits, so he says, okay, well, I wonder if I can bring my innovation skills to trying to solve this problem. So he funds, I think, 6 different companies to compete against one another to try to create a vaccine. I mean, that's incredibly innovative and incredibly amazing, and he should be cheered for that and revered for that. Instead, all these conspiracy theories, all these wackos who place who place, he's not for depopulation. There's nothing in Bill Cage's repertoire for depopulation. He might think that there's a lot of people in the world, and it would be nice if that comes down, but he also realizes that the best way to get the population down is by making them richer. He wouldn't be spending so much money on a solution to polio. Polio kills a lot of people. If you're for depopulation, why would you invest in curing polio? It's so ridiculously stupid, these conspiracy theories. And yet, there are thousands of people who believe this crap. And, you know, I guess they do it in order to support, I don't know what they want to support. He's actually working hard to decrease child mortality. How can he want to kill children if he's working to decrease child mortality? I mean, the insanity of taking one of the great productive geniuses and inventing conspiracy theories around him to make it into a mass murderer is just insane. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You should go bury yourself somewhere and ask for forgiveness from, I don't know, not from me, because I don't think I can forgive. It's just, it drives me nuts. And for what? What is the goal here? What is the goal? To show that billionaires are all evil? So you're a bunch of leftists. You're a bunch of leftists. Yes, you can take a sentence out of anybody's video and take it out of context and spin tales all around it. It's being done to me. I know. I mean, there's plenty of conspiracy theories out there about me online right now. I'm not important enough to have big conspiracy theories. Mine are little ones. But come on, give me a break. All right. On that ugly note, I will thank you all for listening to the show tonight. Thank you for all the Super Chat questionnaires and the ones who just used it as a platform to support the show. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And lots of good questions, lots of good comments. And remember to like the show. You know, I am your voice. So like the show and share the show. That's how we get the voice out there. And support the show. YaronBrookShow.com/support. All right. I'm hoping to have Amesh Adalja on the show tomorrow. I don't know what time. He's basically so busy that he said he's just going to let me know tomorrow what time he can do it, probably during the day. And we're just going to jump into an interview. So if you have questions about coronavirus, about the whole epidemiology of this, the science of this, the stats, the numbers, the solutions, what happened, what should happen, get prepared to ask tomorrow, because that will be with, I think, one of the world experts on this issue, Amesh, and I look forward to talking to him tomorrow. Look forward to talking to you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of your evening.